So our next talk is by Anna Beria. She's a PhD candidate at the Center for Research in Modern European Philosophy in Kingston University in London. Her PhD project is on modality of the absolute, Spinoza, Hegel, Marx, and ecofeminism. And today she will talk about the logic of expression in Deleuze's Spinoza and notions of life and nature in Hegel's Science of Logic. Please.
Thank you so much, and thanks to the organizers for organizing this conference. Yes, so in this talk, I will mainly concentrate on Stephen Houlgate's essay, 2005 essay, Why Hegel's Concept is Not the Essence of Things, in the collection of essays, Hegel's Theory of the Subject, as well as his another essay, Hegel from Logic to Nature, also from 2005. And with this, I will concentrate on the one hand on this particular reading of Hegel's logic of the concept in the Science of Logic, and especially section 3 there, the logic of the idea. And on the other hand, I will try to draw parallels with this reading of Hegel and Deleuze's reading of Spinoza as a philosopher of expression, concentrating there on the logic of the third kind of knowledge, which also, like Hegel's last part of the doctrine of the concept, starts out with the idea of God. So my question, which in the long run is, in my project is in general, the question of the absolute as well, as we heard some discussions about it yesterday. But my question is, what I'm looking at is not the absolute in the essence or as substance in Hegel, but the absolute moment in Hegel's philosophical corpus and also in Spinoza's philosophical corpus in general. And for this reason, the question for this talk will be, can we read the logic of the concept, and especially its last part, the idea, which starts out with life as its immediate determination and ends with nature revealing itself as the absolute idea and absolute method? So can we then read this together with Spinoza's concept of the idea of God and the third kind of knowing or knowledge? And to address this question, I will first, as I said, summarize Professor Houlgate's reading of Hegel in that essay, at least, not yesterday maybe, and then I will turn to Deleuze's interpretation of Spinoza. Thank you. My broader attempt here is to follow the great tradition starting from Machaeri to read Spinoza and Hegel as complementary and compatible systems of thought and look for singular points of intersection between these two philosophies. But I am concentrating specifically on the final moments, the absolute moments. So the third kind of knowledge, or the idea of God nature in Spinoza with its correspondent idea of blessedness and intellectual active love, of God nature, God or nature as nature, and the absolute idea, absolute knowing in Hegel in its relation to the notions of life and nature there, also with its correspondent idea of free love and boundless blessedness. So I will start with Houlgate's essay, and I will quote, according to Professor Houlgate again, I quote, "Many of Hegel's subsequent critiques, Marx, for example, asserted that for Hegel, the idea is an independent subject, the demiurgos of the real world, and that the real world is only the external, phenomenal form of the idea." I continue, "This essentialist and foundationalist interpretation of Hegel is deeply misleading. Hegel's concept is not the underlying or indwelling ground, cause, or substance of the world, nor is it a force within the world or the condition of the world's possibility, whether that condition be thought of as transcendental, existential, or logical. The concept for Hegel is not anything to which being points back. It is simply self-determining being itself, being that determines itself logically to be nothing less than nature and spirit." For Houlgate then, and I am following this reading, the concept proves itself to be at one in its otherness in the process of the idea freely releasing itself, and release is an important word here, into the nature as nature, and so determining the concept at the same time as existing reality. This is then the process which in the end reveals itself to be the immanent process to nature or unfolds itself as nature. And unfolding will be another important word or concept for Deleuze's Spinoza. This logic of, so being as concept determining itself to be nature or proving to be nothing less than nature itself. And this logic of immanence is what, on the one hand, unites Spinoza and Hegel, according to Houlgate, but on the other hand, it is also the key to their main difference for him. I quote, like Spinoza, Hegel is unquestionably a philosopher of immanence rather than transcendence. Unlike Spinoza, however, Hegel understands the world to be embodied reason itself, rather than the effect of an immanent substantial cause. Hegel's thought could thus be said to be Spinozan metaphysics freed from the dominance of essence, end of quote. So this is then the limit to which I will be following Houlgate's essay, because in this essay, for Houlgate, this logic of the concept is precisely what distinguishes Hegel from Spinoza. In other words, Houlgate here more or less follows Hegel's own reading of Spinoza as a philosopher of essence, substance, as if Spinoza's substance, or God, or nature, or read God or nature, was this underlying ground or cause of the world, and not the process identical with its own expression or with the unfolding of its own differences, which we will see is how Deleuze reads Spinoza. And I quote again from Houlgate's essay, this, in my view, is the principal difference between Hegel and Spinoza. For Spinoza, being is ultimately substance that is immanent in, but also logically prior to its modes. It is the immanent cause of its modes. Essence, even as substance, is not simply the unfolding of its differences, but stands in relation to them. That relation is one of logical priority and dominance. Essence governs and is the power over what it posits. For Hegel, I continue quotation, for Hegel, by contrast, being is ultimately concept that is wholly identical with its unfolding differences. Those differences belong to and constitute the concept itself. The concept is thus not their logically prior ground or cause, it is simply the process of differentiating itself into those differences. And I find this, amazing, because it's usually the opposite, for example, in the French Spinozist reception of Hegel, that Spinoza is read in the way that Houlgate reads Hegel here, and Hegel is read in the way that Houlgate reads Spinoza here, and that's what initiated this paper, I think, in me. So Houlgate describes the transition from the logic of essence to the logic of the concept in the science of logic as the transition from the relational reflexive causal ontology to the logic of self-expression and free self-determination. The transition, though, does not mean the linear temporal transition. It's not as if we are first in the logic of essence and then in the logic of the concept. Instead, the logic of essence, relational reflexive causality, proves itself or unfolds itself to always already have been the logic of the concept. In other words, what is characteristic for the concept is then the logic of expression, but one in which the expressed, the expressor, and the expressing are one and the same. Or can we say that? That is my question. And although Houlgate follows Hegel in reading Spinoza as the opposite of this logic, I will try to show that for Deleuze Spinoza, Spinoza is the philosopher who maintains the same understanding of the logic of expression. And here I turn to Deleuze and Spinoza. So for Deleuze, Spinoza's concept of nature as God or substance is precisely the process of its own immanent expression production, the horizontal unfolding of its own singularities, with no hierarchical priority or dominance between being or thought or logic, being or logic, or ontology or logic. So I quote from I think from Deleuze's expressionism in Spinoza, substance is, so to speak, the absolute ontological identity of all qualities, absolutely infinite power, the power of existing in all forms and of thinking all forms. Therefore, it's not that God as subjectivity is brought down to substance as essence, as traditional historical reception of Spinoza holds, but God and substance are united in or as nature, which holds together both subjectivity and objectivity, as well as the physical and conceptual. Because of this horizontality, according to Deleuze, logic, or I quote, explanation, does not signify an operation of the intellect external to the thing, but is always a self-explication, a development, an unfolding, a dynamism. Nature is the common order of explications and implications, end of quote. Following from this, nature's expression is not merely ontological, but also epistemological. Nature expresses itself just as much through ideas. So knowledge, another quotation from Deleuze, so knowledge becomes a sort of expression. The knowledge of things bears the same relation to the knowledge of God as the things themselves to God, so that ideas as a whole exactly reproduce the order of nature as a whole. End of quote. It is then the same absolute power of existence and thought, the essence of nature, and its same logic that is expressed both in the attribute of thought and in extension. And the transition from the second kind of knowledge to the third kind of knowledge is precisely, according to this reading, the transition which leads to the comprehension of this expressive logic of nature rather than the causal reflexive logic of which is the second kind of knowledge in Spinoza, and I will define this kind of knowledge in a second. But first, I want to ask, isn't this then precisely how the absolute idea as the absolute method revealing or releasing itself as nature is defined in Hegel according to Houlgate as well? So before addressing this question, let's look a bit closer at the transitions between kinds of knowledges in Spinoza. So Spinoza differentiates between, and we've talked about this again and again here at this conference, between first kind of knowledge, so I will just be very brief about it. So first kind of knowledge, which is imaginative affective knowledge, second kind of knowledge, adequate knowledge of cause and effect, so second kind of knowledge, and third kind of knowledge, intuitive knowledge or intellectual love of God as nature. What leads from the second kind of knowledge, causal relational knowledge, which could always search for another adequate cause in the manner of bad infinity and go on towards quantitative infinity, just as the causal relational logic of essence in Hegel could go on and on. So what leads from this causal knowledge to the third kind of knowledge, which is qualitatively different from it, or which I argue is qualitatively infinite in Spinoza, is the idea of God or nature as the common notion, or the notion of the common that expresses itself in all existing beings or thoughts. And I want to note here about my question that during the other talk about the qualitative infinity, that the argument about existence of quantitative infinity in Spinoza, I think, depends on how we understand attributes and what they express. And according to this reading, what is the same and is expressed in all the attributes is the essence of substance, which is the causal chain of the order, of the causal chain of the order and connections. And how we understand that causal chain, whether we understand it as infinite or finite, is precisely dependent on kind of knowledge. And infinity is precisely not quantitative but qualitative from the third kind of knowledge then. So the idea of God or nature then, according to Deleuze, expresses what is common to all existing modes as existing, including ideas, that they all are the expressions of one and the same God-nature substance. And with this, the idea of God or nature gives internal essential determination of existence, including existence of thought or logic, as the expression of nature, rather than looking for one more external cause for singular existence ad infinitum, which would be bad infinity, and which would determine it from the outside. So the external causality becomes internal self-expression here. What is more, Deleuze asserts that for Spinoza, the third kind of knowledge does not occur progressively, but is found as eternally given, found as what has always already been there as expression. And this too is similar to how Houlgate describes the transition to the logic of the concept and the idea, not as linear temporal transition. The transition to the third kind of knowledge, similarly, then, is not a transition, but the revealing or unfolding of what was always already there. Here we find ourselves aligned with the idea of God or nature, where there is no distinction between us as active and God or nature as active. And we grasp, therefore, the necessity of God-nature substance as our own necessity, external necessity as internal necessity, and therefore as freedom. And from this follows that this is a self-knowledge united with nature, where the distinction between the subject of knowledge and the object of knowledge disappears. So, because through the third kind of knowledge we grasp the idea of nature as the infinite common cause of all, which transgresses the linear cause and effect type of, well, again, bad infinity logic in Hegel, and through this understanding leads to the love of what is common in all, the idea of nature is then freely expressing itself here in all singular existence. And Deleuze describes this as the process when life, I quote, life, that is expressivity, is carried into the absolute. But isn't life carried into the absolute precisely what is the task of the section 3 of the Doctrine of the Concept, the idea, which goes through the idea of cognition, and then the absolute idea? Can we then again read Hegel's logic of the idea in relation to this Deleuzean interpretation of Spinoza? For Hegel, the logic of the concept determining itself as idea does precisely start out as life and end up in the absolute idea to be determined as nature. And I will try to look closely at this process now. So life, according to Hegel in Science of Logic, is immediacy of the idea without its concept, or the concept which externalizes itself as life. But it is precisely to recognize the concept in this immediacy, to go through the idea of cognition, that leads life to the absolute idea, which turns out to always already have been nature. It is then precisely the concepts or ideas' self-recognition in life that reveals life to be the absolute idea as nature and at one with its own expressivity. Life is then idea of nature, but at its externality to itself, to the idea, before cognizing itself as self-expression. Because of this, life is, I quote, the concepts from Hegel, right? Yes. The concept state of unfreedom, it's being sunk into externality. While the absolute idea, end of quote, while the absolute idea is what merges life and cognition together and with this reveals itself as nature or releases itself as nature. And I would prefer the term release here. With this, the idea passes over into nature and the identity of the concept or logic and reality nature is found as its own truth. Or the concept finds truth in nature, identity of itself and reality, in the absolute idea. So the immediate idea, life, with its self-reflection, the idea of cognition, concept comprehension of itself, turns into the absolute idea by recognizing itself in life, recognizing the idea in life. And with this, transforming into the, I quote, infinite idea in which cognizing and doing are equalized and which is the absolute knowledge of itself as nature. This is when the idea discloses itself or unfolds itself as nature, according to Houlgate's own essay, another essay from 2005, From Logic to Nature. But isn't this the same process as we saw in the case of the third kind of knowledge in Deleuze's understanding of Spinoza? The last part of my comparison is, well, then this is why, as nature becomes the process of its own free self-expression in Hegel, the absolute idea determines itself to be the absolute method, right? So the absolute method is the knowing of this infinite idea in which cognizing and doing are equalized. And that is why it is the absolute knowledge of itself as nature, or the knowing for which the concept is not only a subject matter, but it is as its own subjective act. So here, thought becomes not a reflection of externality, but its own self-generation in the process of self-expression, with its logic being not separate, autonomous, or prior to nature, but being itself nature. And I maintain that this is precisely what thought, the attribute of thought, shows itself to be in the third kind of knowledge, or the intuitive knowledge, or the intellectual love in Spinoza, where, in Spinoza, one's power of action, including thinking, is just the power of nature itself insofar as it is explicated through one's essence, as nature is explicated through one's essence, singular essence. If then, for Hegel, this is what determines the absolute method, that it is not some absolute to be known externally, but the process of absolute knowing itself, and here I follow Angelica Nuzzo in her argument that Hegel replaces the metaphysical absolute with a theory of absolute cognition. So if this is how we understand absolute method as absolute knowing in Hegel, I would argue that the absolute method as the process of absolute cognition can, in this respect, be compared to the third kind of knowing as the end of the method, as understood in Spinoza's corpus as well, or at least in Deleuze's interpretation of it. Not the knowledge of some external thing anymore, and for that reason, that which cannot be learned from others also, while one is remaining passive. Not having a separate object of knowledge, but itself being the singular knowledge of our own singular power of comprehension of our understanding. So for that reason, according to Deleuze, Spinoza's method, which is understood as the path simultaneously to freedom and truth, or for the internal as well as external freedom, is precisely this going towards the end of philosophy as the knowledge separated from its object and revealing what was there all along in life. And I quote from Deleuze, "There is then a philosophy of life in Spinoza. It consists precisely in denouncing all that separates us from life, towards where there is no longer any difference between the concept and life, or where concept has cognized itself in life as nature," in Hegel, I would argue. Do I have time, or 5 minutes? Wow. Well, then I will continue, okay. So I maintain that, So what I need to do further is, of course, to look at the concepts of life and nature, not in this last part of Science of Logic, but in other, for example, in the Encyclopedia and the Philosophy of Nature in Hegel. And this is what I'm trying, and to kind of put it together, the differences between the concept of life and nature in Hegel in Phenomenology, in Science of Logic, and in Philosophy of Nature. But what I maintain is that the nature in the Encyclopedia of Philosophy of Nature, at least, is not the same nature as the nature in science in the last part of the Science of Logic, which I read together with the third kind of knowledge in Spinoza here, because nature there is an externalized nature already, or nature as nature which exhibits no freedom in its existence, but only necessity and contingency. And that is the idea which is not the free idea, freely releasing itself as nature, which is the nature, the concept of nature in the end of logic as the absolute idea. But just as in Spinoza, third kind of knowledge always coexists with the first kind of knowledge and second kind of knowledge because and because of this epistemic contingency as well, always remains for us in life, so for the finite modes, a part of nature. Since while the body exists, duration and eternity themselves coexist in Spinoza, similarly, I would say that for Hegel, the absolute idea of nature is coexistent with the external determinate nature, and nature is just as much the real realm of contingency as of rational self-development. And so, just as the intellectual knowledge of God considers his nature as it is in itself, a nature man cannot imitate by any particular way of life and cannot take as a model for instituting the true way of life. Also in Hegel, it is not in ordinary life that we come to grasp the absolute idea as nature, but in philosophy, when we think of nature as nature in itself and not as determinate life. And that would be something similar to the third kind of knowledge in Spinoza. So, yes, another point as a self-criticism of myself, I think. So one point is to expand on the difference between the concept of life and nature in Hegel. But another one is to look at the formulations of revelation and expression, both in Hegel and Spinoza. And obviously, at first look, it seems like revelation has only negative connotations in Spinoza, while in Hegel, the idea reveals itself to be the nature. So how do we read this together? But I think that the distinction that Spinoza makes in theological political treatise between that's what I'm looking at for this, and I'm interested in what maybe if there will be in discussion we can talk about it, that in theological political treatise, for example, Spinoza differentiates between the revelation of the prophets who understand God's laws as commands and God anthropomorphically as a lawgiver, in case of Adam, for example, and the universal understanding of truth that, for example, Christ represents for Spinoza, who understands these revelations, the same revelations, not as revelations accommodated to and dependent on their subject, or on the person who is understanding them, but as the universal natural necessities and the expressions of truth. So can we say that this is the same distinction as the distinction between the first kind of knowledge, revelations as understood through imagination, and the third kind of knowledge, the same thing, the same laws, the same life, understood through as universal expression common to all? So this issue needs to be examined further in Spinoza, and on the other hand, the relations between revealing and release and unfolding and disclosing of the idea in Hegel needs to be also examined further in order to see whether parallels can be maintained between this and the expressive logic in Spinoza. Thank you.
Well, thank you for your talk. So do we have some questions, Bojana?
So thank you for your, is it working? Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
So thank you for your really interesting talk. Now, my question concerns the notion frei entlassen, free release you were talking about. So it seems that in your reading, free release is the idea that unfolds, idea unfolding itself in nature, idea in the form of otherness, in short, idea that follows the logic of Äußerlichkeit, expression and recognition. But as far as I understand it, frei entlassen seems to imply a different kind of logic that follows no such pattern of expression, but rather points to Ohnmacht der Natur. So nature is intelligible in Hegel, yes, of course, but at the same time, it reveals inability to discern any conceptual structures, at least not visibly. So nature is a problem, concludes Hegel, and it seems it poses problem for the concepts too. Namely, in the sense, he said, nature sets limits to all philosophy, clearly in Encyclopedia, in the sense that it somehow, yes, poses a problem to the concept to cognize itself as an absolute ground that includes also difference in it. Now, how is this to be understood is, of course, remains open. But I just want you to, to make maybe a bit more comment on this expression and free release thing. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Yes, like at first, the first reaction is I don't know what else to say, than to just repeat this last point that I think that the concept of nature in Encyclopedia and in the end of Science of Logic are different in the sense, and nature, how nature is understood by the absolute idea is not the nature that is the problem in the other parts, in the other writings, or even in another sense. So nature, what you said, of course, is that nature is a problem because it almost like doesn't have the subject who discerns this, it's absolute logic almost in itself. But what I'm thinking, how I want to approach it is that it is precisely the absolute method or the absolute idea only, for which then nature is not in that sense problematic anymore, because their nature is the free, or like this absolute idea itself is the free release as nature, and so they kind of merge in that moment, and that's why that's why I'm trying to look at it from the logic of expression, which would not make sense for other concept, for other parts of where Hegel mentions nature. No, please, yeah, please.
So then Äußerlichkeit and Freien-Lassung are the same thing, but why is then he repeating himself? I mean,
they are not.
Because Äußerlichkeit can be understood also in the sense you've just described.
I think that they're not they depends on where can I say, I don't know if I'm, but yeah, thank you.
Okay, I think we have 3 more questions at this point. Microphone.
Yeah, relax. Just before I should say, I mean, most of us have the luxury of giving papers on people who are dead. You're very brave to do this, so relax, it was fine. In fact, more than fine, I thought actually that, if I'm allowed to say so, that the parallel you're drawing between these Hegel as I'm understanding it and Deleuze is very interesting. And I just wanted to suggest maybe a way in which there's still a difference between Deleuze's Spinoza and my Hegel, if you like.
Yeah, you have to take.
I've got a make jacket.
Yeah.
Okay, all right, okay, sorry, okay. Well, I don't have to repeat everything, do I?
No.
Okay, I just wanted to say I'm impressed by this idea of a parallel between Deleuze's Spinoza and my Hegel, with particular regard to one idea, self-expression, which I think you highlighted. But I think this focusing on that also allows us to see where subtle differences also remain, and I just wanted to get your thoughts about those. Yitzhak, who unfortunately had to leave, criticizes Ed Curley for understanding the modes as simply the effects of that's all they are apparently for Curley. Well, that's clearly not true. They are also expressions of substance. Deleuze is right about that, I think. But nonetheless, the modes are self-expressions that substance causes itself to have. And so there's still a sense, it seems to me, even with Deleuze's Spinoza, that those expressions, those modal expressions, point back to the immanent substance which causes them. Now, you associated self-expression in my Hegel with a different idea, with self-determination. And I think that's right. I think Hegel understands, and this particularly when we carry on to nature, nature is on the one hand the Außer-sich-Sein, the Idee als Außer-sich-Sein. So it's not expression in the sense of force and expression, let's not get caught up into that. But there is a sense in which it is the idea that's externalized itself. And yet, the idea determines itself through nature. So we have, if you like, to put it very crudely, a sort of forward momentum in Hegel's philosophy of nature through different forms of determination. And one of the important effects of that is that for Hegel, there's no univocity of being. There's no univocity of being because what emerges in the course of nature are different forms of nature. The idea, if you like, determines itself, expresses itself in different ways. Mechanical matter is not physical matter, is not chemical matter, is not life. And the one is not reducible to the other. But for for Spinoza, because self-expression is at the same time the self-causing of substance, all modes point back to effectively the same kind of causation. So there is a univocity of being, and Deleuze celebrates that in Spinoza. And I just wonder if you could comment on that difference.
Yeah.
So even though, yes, I think you're right to see these parallels, and it's a pity Deleuze was so blind that he couldn't read Hegel properly to see what you've seen. But there are still these little differences, and I wonder if you could comment on those, if that's not too
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, and it's an honor really to have you here and base my paper on your work, of course, and in general. But yeah, very good. Of course, like a very good question, and I do need to write more about the differences as well. But of course, like I don't want to say that there are no differences, definitely. But still, on your first question, I think that about the modes and substance, and the fact that in Spinoza, modes point back to in Spinoza, modes point back to substance, and in Hegel, or like that's why it's different. I don't think that's not how I read Spinoza. Because why? Because if modes do actually point back to substance, that would mean that there is a substance somewhere to which modes could point back. Yes, but exactly. So substance only exists through modes. So I think that's why there is no substance that is separate from modes that the modes point back to. But it's only the self-expression of substance is itself the existence of modes. So that's why I'm reading this differently.
Then you lose causality. Sorry.
Why do I lose causality? I think, again, causality is the second kind of knowledge, right? Or like causality is like the causal relational chain is how the relationship of expression between substance and modes can be understood, but it's not understood as a causal relationship from the third kind of knowledge. And that's what that's why I think that the third kind of knowledge goes beyond the causality of substance, like goes beyond it and goes more. Like causality is not the same as expression. Causal logic is not the same as expressive logic. And on the second, but maybe we should talk about this more, definitely. But on the second question about the university of being, I had like 2 points that I want to respond to. First is, you mentioned there is forward development in Hegel of which is not so much there in Spinoza, and I agree. And I think that would be like a one main and very important difference, which a lot of people have written about as well, that there is this still like this teleological or like progressive development in Hegel, which is not there in Spinoza, and that is an important difference that I would definitely look into. But on the other hand, about the university of being in Spinoza, yes, I think that in Hegel as well, in this like absolute idea where the idea releases itself as nature freely and determines itself as self-expresses itself in nature. Of course, like in the logic, in the science of logic, we have the differences between like physics, all this, like for example, chemism and etc. etc. But I don't think that they would be understood as, or like I think that the absolute idea's free release kind of unites. Uniting is not the right word, but like grasps them all in itself. And I think that's exactly like, of course, that's where being is univocal, but not as just being. Again, just as in Spinoza, it's not just being, right? It's or being, but understood also as thought and extension at the same time. So not just being as different from logic. And so, yeah, that's what I would try to maintain, but maybe I won't be able to. Thank you.
Yes, Ms. Beria, thank you for your presentation. I would also like to do some suggestions. First, I think at the end in your reaction to Stephen, you said, yeah, in a way, the absolute idea grasps all these other determinations of mechanics and so on. But in your talk, you continuously focused on the idea that the absolute idea is only method. Now, I think this should be maybe formulated a bit more complex, because now you seem to suggest that there is a method in contrast or in relationship to content. Whereas here the whole idea is, of course, that we have a unity of method and content. And then at the end, Hegel, so to say, focuses again on the form and tries to distinguish these moments of beginning and so on. Well, you know that.
Yeah.
So, but this points out to, I think, my main suggestion is that you maybe more strongly try to focus on the method of development. Because if you do that, I think you could also get a bit clearer the relationship between the idea, the absolute idea, and then in particular the transition to nature, and why at the end of the development of nature, again we are at life, but now at life that cognizes itself, like life in the logic at the end transites in the idea of cognition, and so to say you get this whole unity. And then it's also much easier to introduce. So maybe I don't agree with this idea that you have, that the concept of nature at the end of the big and small logic, they differ. I think the argument for the transition into nature is much more clear in the encyclopedia. Yeah. But that doesn't mean that the concept is a different one. But okay. So but then you could also stronger emphasize what it means that nature is, as Stephen just also pointed out, the absolute idea in the element of its otherness.
Yes.
So that is nature.
Yes.
So you can have that, and then with regard also to Spinoza, I think it's important. Then, if you focus in this way on the method, then it would be very important how Hegel, so to say, now starts interpreting the empirical nature in terms of this general concept of nature that he has. So therefore, you should, so to say, develop an idea what the relationship is between empirical cognition and philosophical one. And then I think you can do that all in terms of the method, and then you get the big picture, and I think a much more solid picture for a comparison with Spinoza, because then I think the differences will become much bigger.
Thank you so much. No, thank you so much. Thank you. I really appreciate it. And I think that I agree, of course, that on the one hand, I also agree that nature is not a different concept, obviously, but I think that the concept of nature is, well, differently used, can I say, in the beginning of encyclopedia, for example, and has a different meaning of using also for absolute method. I will turn to that in the end in the absolute idea, because absolute idea in its otherness is nature, of course, but not the nature. It is not the nature which is the free release of the absolute idea in the moment. So there is this difference that I think that there is, like, if the absolute idea is, if we follow Hegel to the end, towards the absolute idea, I think that there is the concept of nature can be grasped, which is not the same as something that which is external and in its otherness. And as for the method, I think that what is so interesting for me in both in Hegel and in Spinoza is that this understanding of method, which is not a method external, not as an external method anymore, as like again, like I mentioned this Angelica Nuzzo in her argument that method here in Hegel is nothing other than absolute knowing itself rather than a knowledge, which means that it is the process. So it's not anymore a method which we can use, for example, an empirical or philosophical method which we can use in order to do something, but it is the process of knowing itself which becomes the method. So different kind of knowing would be a different method then, and that's, yes. But thank you so much for, I don't know if I answer, of course, like it was a comment, so it was very interesting, thank you.
One last question.
Thank you so much for the talk. I'm very interested in the topic. And yeah, my first question was a little bit the same. This difficulty I have to understand in what sense nature at the end of logic is something other as nature in the philosophy of nature, but you told something about. And I wanted to highlight 2 points that has to do with the structure of the idea and with the free release of the idea. So we used in the discussion 2 different expressions in order to explain this free release. And the first one was self-expression, and the second one by Stephen was self-determination. I would say self-knowing of the idea is a movement of self-knowing of the idea. But I think that these 3 determinations, and first of all, self-expression and self-determination, self-knowing are a little bit different. They produces, so to say, different consequences. And so this was my first point. And the second point has to do with free release, and there is a difficulty, and Bojana think about it, I think, because Hegel speaks about a decision of the idea, and a decision as the uses of the word what. Yeah, and the uses of the word entschließen, Entschluss, is a sort of, is a moment of difference, so to say. There is a cut in the Entschluss. It is not an unfolding that comes so linear from the absolute idea to the nature, but there is a sort of cut. And in this sense, I think that what Bojana said, there is a different logic in this movement that is no more the logic that we found in the unfolding of the determination of thought into the science of logic.
Thank you so much. I'm just going to write this down so that I can respond to you then. Thank you so much. Thank you. Great points. And on the first question, I think I will disappoint you in my answer because I will try to put what you really well differentiated. I will try to read them together still. Yeah. So I think that the first point about the differences between self-expression, self-determination, and self-knowing, but also at the same time that all 3 of them are in the process, are there in the process of this free release, is, I think, exactly what's so amazing about it. Because I think that the fact that this free release also includes all 3 of them, but they're not exactly the same, I agree. But I think how I would try to read it is that they're not exactly the same because they kind of point to if I would have to say it in Spinozian language, to different attributes maybe. Because what I mean is that, for example, self-knowing, self-determination, and self-expression, and to kind of unite all of them in this free release means precisely that it's not just kind of blind self-expression without self-knowing. it's not just self-knowing without active self-expression, and it's not just either one of them without active, again, almost like a decisive self-determination, which means that, there is all three of them. Like, a self-determination has some kind of connotation with decision, I think. Self-knowing, the fact that it can be conceptually grasped, and self-expression, the fact that it is like the being. So that's how I would relate these concepts to each other. And I think that's kind of related to the decision point. I think, for my reading to work, how I would try to understand decision is that it's not necessarily a decision, not a decision as classically understood in relation to like necessarily a separate will of the idea, and then which is then separate from nature, but as pointing to the fact that this free self-release and self-expression is not blind. It's in a way conscious. It's in a way including thought or including reflexivity. It's self-reflexive also, and that's why it's not automatic self-release, which would then not. That's why I think that this decision kind of points to that it's not just an automatic something without subject there, right? But the subject, in a sense, would be just the same as the fact that it is intelligible, or the fact that would be the same for me as something like the attribute of thought in Spinoza, which means that the fact that this self-expression and self-determination and self-knowing is the same in thought as in extension, which means that it is intelligible. It is not automatic. It is not just. Yeah, so that's why I think that it is, also that's why, because I understand this decision as like reflexivity or thought, that's why the nature into which it unfolds is not just nature separate from thought or separate from idea, right? It is nature which is logical, right? It's not just ontology and then the logic is separate from it, right? So that's why I don't know. Thank you so much.
Okay.